We've all seen directive selectors, and earlier in the course we looked at a pretty vanilla example of a selector for a directive. A standard attribute that applied the directive's functionality to whatever element it was applied to. But there are other selectors we can use as well to get either granular or broad depending on how we need our directive applied. All of these present some pretty interesting ways to modify our UI, so let's list them out here and then go take a look in our demo. First, a selector for an element. Here our directive will be applied to every anchor tag. A selector using a CSS class. Our directive will be applied to any element with that class. A slightly more complex class selector, here using not to control where the directive is applied, a little more granularly. Multiple classes. Filtering the elements to which the directive will be applied via an attribute. And like multiple classes, applying the directive via multiple selectors, but this time combining different selector types. Working with directives, I'm assuming that everybody's familiar with what are called attribute selectors, which is when you actually take the selector for your directive and add it as an attribute onto an element. That's the typical usage. But we want to look at some other selectors. So we have just some text on the page. You can see mostly I'm changing color based on some criteria that we'll take a look at when we get into the directives. So I have a style sheet that just applies some of the colors. In my HTML, you can see this is what delivers that unordered list on the browser page. I have a simple anchor tag. I have a span with an attribute selector of qualified. I have another span that does not have that attribute selector, so it's not qualified. And then I just have a bunch of spans that have different CSS classes. So class, class 1, and class 2, class 3. And then last I have a span that has another attribute selector just called HS paywall. Looking at the selector directives TypeScript file, now I have these all in one file just for simplicity's sake. Typically I would break them out, but I wanted to be able to get through them fairly quickly with you. So we start with a selector that is just anything with the CSS class of class. That's going to be changed to blue. Now in the constructor, you see I'm injecting an element ref. This gives me a reference to the whatever item my directive is applied to. So in this case, it's anything that has this class on it. I'm also injecting a renderer2. Now renderer2 is something we're going to take a look at a little bit later in the course. But for now, just understand that renderer2 and native element used properly are how you're supposed to manipulate the UI inside Angular. So scrolling down, we have a slightly more complex selector. We're saying anything that has class 1 but not class 2 is going to be green. Here we're applying multiple selectors. And we're using selectors of different types. So we're using a class selector, anything with class 3, or that has the HS paywall attribute selector. So anything that has one of those is going to be colored orange. Now here's an interesting one. We're saying apply this to all of the anchor tags anywhere on my page. We come down here and we're going to add this class to it, class from directive. Now the interesting thing about this is I said it's anywhere on my page. I don't actually have to add this directive anywhere. Simply having it in a module that's been imported in the current set of components is going to go and touch every anchor tag. So be aware of that, because that may give you much broader reach than you expect. It can also make things a little bit harder to troubleshoot because there's nothing explicitly on the page that says, for example, this as an anchor tag is going to be updated. The presentation is going to be updated in some way. The directive applies to all anchor tags whenever this module is imported. Scrolling down, we have here's our span with the attribute selector of qualified. So that says that it's going to apply to this span, but not to this one, because this second one doesn't have the attribute selector qualified, so it wouldn't apply there. And if I had something else on my page, like if I went in and added the selector here, it would not apply there because it's not a span, it's an anchor tag. So I'm qualifying this to say only spans that have that attribute selector are going to get this class 2 from Directive class added to them. So that shows us some different ways that we can use selectors besides just a simple attribute selector. And like I said, in some cases, when you're selecting off of an element, you don't even have to do anything. It's going to apply to all instances of that element. So using this to our advantage really gives us some power for manipulating the way directives apply to the content on our pages.